This program is to mark the 7th Yahrtzeit of David Shapell Zichrono Livrocha and the first Yahrtzeit of Fela Shapell Zichrono Livrocha. I don't think there are many people sitting in the audience right now who have the privilege of knowing either of them. They used to visit the yeshiva and the Dreshet Rachel frequently. But you lost an opportunity if you've never met them. So I want to share some thoughts on their greatness, what we learned from them, and of course the Hakarat HaTov that everyone sitting in this room, as well as alumni listening on Zoom, need to have for them. So, the Psukim in Tehillim, you're used to saying it once a month at Hallel. Hamashpili lirot bashamayim uva'aretz. The Almighty comes down from heaven to look at what's going on the earth. Mikimi me'afar dal me'ashpot yarim evyon. He raises up a dal, a poor person from a dust. Ume'ashpot, from the garbage, he elevates the evyon, the destitute person. He does that lahoshivi im nidivei amo. He does that to place those people, the dal and the evyon that he raised up, to place them with nidivim. Nidivim are the generous ones, the givers. Im nidivei amo, the nidivim of the nation. We'll see in a few minutes that redundancy of nidivim and nidivei amo. The first pasuk that we just read, it describes Holocaust survivors. The miracle of Holocaust survivors. Every survivor has their story of the miracles. And the Metzudas David, in one word, says, Mikimi me'afar dal. So he says, Mikimi behashgachato. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu raises the dal with hashgacha. Every Holocaust survivor has their stories of the miracles by which they were saved. And they are placed among the Nedivim, the givers. Every Holocaust survivor had the absolute justification to say, we are victims. The community owes us. The world owes us. But no one with that attitude ever succeeded. The only ones who succeeded were those that pulled themselves up and were looking to make a contribution. If you're a victim, you can't make a contribution. A non-victim retains belief in the Almighty and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It has a belief in the purpose of life. His Holocaust experiences were what got Viktor Frankl to write his book, Man's Search for Meaning. The realization that those that survived had purpose from the beginning. They had belief and purpose, and they were always focused on the future. Those people are truly nidivim. Nidivim, generosity, givers. You have to be a giver in order to survive. You have to be focused on purpose. Why do I want to survive this hell, this tragedy? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises, Lahoshivim nidivim. I'm going to place these people who have that focus, that purpose, that desire to give for purpose. I'm going to place them with Nedivim, because they're starting out as generous people. They're going to be the Gevirim, the wealthy, the ones who have resources to give. But not just Nedivim, but says the Maharal, says the Malbim, that what is the idea of Nedivei Amo? So you have wealthy people in a community, and they're wealthy and they're recognized as wealthy people. And somebody goes to a new community, a wealthy person. Nedivei Amo, says the Malbim, is the person will be recognized in the community as something special. They just didn't have wealth. They built themselves up from nothing to become Nedivim for the nation. This is how the Malbim explains Nedivei Amo. The community will recognize them as not just givers, but givers who built themselves into givers. There's no question that what enabled David and Fela to survive the hells of the forests of Poland and the concentration camp of Auschwitz, it was a conviction of Jewish eternity. We are surviving for a purpose. It's miraculous to see the blessings that HaKadosh Baruch Hu bestowed on these people and many others like them. But it's a fulfillment of this pasuk in Tehillim. What was their vision? What was their nediv? What was unique? Unique, I assume there were others, many others like that. But we knew David and Fela very well. And there were really three foci of their philanthropic agenda, which reflected their hierarchy, their principles, their values of the needs and future of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are built. The history of the Jewish people, we have it in many different areas of our holidays and our liturgy. We focus on the past to live in the present for the future. And David and Fela combined those three things in a very complex but very beautiful way. Holocaust education. Focusing on the past. We can't let the past be forgotten. We have to know what Jewish history has been like. The Holocaust was one extreme manifestation of the Jewish people being hounded, being tortured. When we thought anti-Semitism was going away, we see it's not going away. We have to know the history of the Holocaust. That was one of their foci. They supported Yad Vashem, Holocaust museums, and the Holocaust program at Shapell's and Midrash Rachel. It was at their behest that we began that program. That's the past. The present is the state of Israel. To hear David, a Holocaust survivor, talk about the state of Israel, talk about the army. They were great donors to the part of the army that provided recreation for the soldiers. They contributed much money to recreation centers for the soldiers, and they made sure that in every recreation center that they had built, there was a Sefer Torah and a shul. That's the present. The Jewish people here and now, worrying about the comfort and the religiosity of the Israeli soldiers, and big donors to the state of Israel, investors in the state of Israel. And then there's the future. And the future was in their investment in Jewish education. Continuity, building families. That's why all of you are sitting here. That's why they supported Shapell's, why they supported Midrash Rachel. That's why they were so enthusiastic about our married couples program. The future of the Jewish people is Jewish education and Jewish families. And in Los Angeles, they were major contributors to all of the Jewish education causes. Such a revenge on Hitler. Such a focus on purpose. Hitler thought he's destroying us, and we have museums to commemorate and to tell the history of how we withstood it. The state of Israel, what a revenge on Hitler. And Jewish education, Jewish families, the Jewish future. It requires conviction of purpose. Anybody who considers themselves a victim can never accomplish anything. We mentioned during Elul, a person who considers himself a victim and everything that happens to them is somebody else's fault. So anytime something goes wrong, they never take responsibility because it's somebody else's fault. Conviction of purpose, responsibility, versus the mentality that's circulating today of victimization. We mentioned this a number of years ago. Aaron HaKohen, Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom, Ohev Es Habrios, Mekarven LaTorah. Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom is peace and harmony. So it was well known in Los Angeles, in the shul, that they were major players in. And of course, anybody who has been involved in shuls around the world knows that one of the things that always exists in shuls is machlokas. Everybody has an opinion, and everybody's fighting for their opinion, and there's always machlokas. And David was well known to run from machlokas. I heard from both David and Fela more than once, and they were in the shul in Los Angeles, Beth Jacob, through a number of different rabbis. And, each time a new rabbi comes in, there's always people who aren't so happy. Well, this rabbi isn't doing it like the old rabbi, and this is the rabbi that we want, and they always had a word, and I heard this from them more than once. They said to me, Rabbi, because they also called me Rabbi, even though they knew me since I was a little kid. He's our rabbi, we have to give him the authority. And they said that with each new rabbi. Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom. Ohev Es Habrios. They cared about people. If you went in, I don't remember what day of the week, but it was the same day of the week, every week, if you went into Pat's restaurant, that's the fancy kosher restaurant in Los Angeles, Mrs. Shapell was at a table with widows. Once a week, she took widows out to lunch. Lonely widows. Ohev Es Habrios. But there was also something very unique about the mutual respect that they had for others. My wife remembers we were together in Los Angeles at the shul as a scholar in residence program for Shavuos. And you probably know what happens during Yizkor, is that before Yizkor, there's a Yizkor appeal. And they were making an appeal, I believe it was something for Israel, for the soldiers. I don't remember exactly what it was. It could have been that it was in the middle of terrorism and suicide bombs. There was a big appeal. The rabbi's making an appeal. And of course, David was one of the first pledges. You know how it works. You get the wealthy people to make a pledge so that everybody, $36,000. Well, now the guy was going to give $100. He's a little bit embarrassed. And that ups the game. And the pledges were coming in. And they were coming in very nicely. And all of a sudden, we see David get up from his seat, walk around to the mechitza, which wasn't that high, and where his wife was sitting at the edge of the mechitza, and they whisper something back and forth. Then he goes back to his seat, he raises his hand, $100,000. My wife, who saw this, says to me, you know what just happened? Because she was sitting next to Fela. You know what just happened? Before he increased his pledge, he wanted to talk to her about it, consult with her, give her the cover that I'm not going to just do this unilaterally. And again, the examples, if you saw them together as a couple, the mutual respect, the love, the devotion that they had. She was so devoted, always thinking to take care of all of his needs, and he never did anything without consulting with her. And I hope that they won't mind the joke, since one of the rabbis of the shul told it, and that's where I heard it from. And I don't remember exactly the context, but we were sitting around at a Shabbos table, and he says, and the rabbi mentioned that he was once at the Shapell home for a Friday night meal, and you guys and the girls too could realize when you're at a Shabbos meal as guests, it's appropriate when the meal finishes to help clear the table. So the rabbi gets up to start to clear the table, to help clear the table. And David says to him, Rabbi, I've had a good thing going with my wife for 30 years. Please don't ruin it. Okay? These are the jokes, but this was mutual respect. The dignity, when you saw them walk, they carried. Fela was regal. She came from a regal home in Europe. She was regal, the dignity. It's amazing that a woman who went through what she went through in Auschwitz carried herself so regally, with such dignity, her whole life. We mentioned devotion and commitment. Commitment to each other, commitment to the Jewish people, commitment to the Almighty, who took them through the hell and facilitated their ability to rebuild their lives so that they became major players in rebuilding the Jewish community after the Holocaust. You have to have hakarat hatov for their recognition of the importance of Shapell's Midrash Rachel, of what we're doing. It took a while to. They don't just give away the money frivolously, quickly, every little cause. They did research, and our approach resonated with them. Drachea darchei Noah. Even though David sometimes gave me a tough time because he thought we weren't this enough or we were too that much enough. But at the end of the day, he always said, Rabbi, I have confidence in you. You know the business. Because it was Drachea darchei Noam, that we didn't have one box or one brand. He appreciated the diversity. And of course, the fact that 25-30% of our alumni live in Eretz Yisrael. That was beautiful. And the fact that we have 500 married couples. All of this spoke to them. And that's why they supported us. And you have to have hakarat hatov to them and to their family that's continuing that support. They need to serve as role models for you. What does it mean to have commitment? What does it mean to have devotion? What does it mean to live lives of purpose and service? HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't put you into the afar and the ashpa that He put them into. And although I give you a bracha that He will, probably not going to put you at the nediv level that they were at. You didn't have their problems. You probably won't have all their resources. But the thing that you have to share with them is devotion, commitment, whatever resources HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives you, whatever talents He has given you, whatever difficult situations you find yourselves in, and you will find yourselves in difficult situations, the focus on the future, meaning, service, purpose, that's what you can learn from them. That's what you can emulate. You all have that opportunity. And we want to honor their memory with extra limud Torah and extra good midos, Midos was something very important. To David, that was probably the most important thing. And if he used to complain to me about what's going on outside in the Orthodox world, it was, where's the Midos? Where's the Menschlichkeit? Hopefully you're picking that up here. We express our appreciation for the support that they gave and the family continues to give. We hold them out as role models for you. Yehi Zichram Baruch. We're also honored now to have with us illustrious alum. I'm going to quote something that he said on a video, and I know he remembers it, but it needs to be repeated. I wish we could put it up as a tagline after, which was first, Harvard or Princeton? Princeton. So it's 4 years in Princeton, 2 years at Shapell's, then 3 years at Harvard. This is Dan Polisar, an illustrious alum. But what he said on video, so I guess it must be true, is that 2 years at Shapell's was more intellectually challenging and growth-focused than all 7 of those other years. We're very honored to have Dan, who has made some tremendous accomplishments since he left Shapell's, and he's going to now give us a lecture on something very important to understand the transition in Israel of the attitude to Holocaust survivors.
First of all, I want to thank Rabbi Karlinsky for those generous words of introduction, and to thank the leadership of Darchei Noam Midreshet Rachel for inviting me to speak here. It's an enormous honor to speak on this occasion marking the Yahrtzeits of David and Fela Shapell of blessed memory. I need to open with an apology, which is not usually a great way to start out in life. Better to have them towards the end, but I'm going to apologize in advance if I lose my voice or if it's not strong enough, and if I have a coughing fit in the middle. I'm at what I hope is the tail end of non-infectious, I repeat, non-infectious bronchitis. And this is the first time in about 2 weeks that I'm going to try to speak for more than a minute at a time. We'll see how it goes. But the subject and the place and the people we're honoring are such that I felt that I should come out and give it my best. The subject we're going to be talking about today is the trial of Adolf Eichmann. And he was, of course, the Nazi most responsible for the final solution, the murder of 6 million Jews. At the end of World War II, when literally hundreds of Nazi war criminals were rounded up and were tried, he managed to escape with the help of all sorts of people, mostly Nazis, but other collaborators, and made it to Argentina under an assumed name, Ricardo Clement. And over the course of a decade and a half, there were numerous attempts to try to find out where he was, to capture him, to bring him to some kind of justice. And none of them succeeded, so it seemed, until May of 1960. And on May 23rd, 1960, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion asked for special permission to make an announcement at the Knesset. They were supposed to be having a very dull discussion, but people heard there's this special announcement, so everybody's there waiting to hear what he says. And I'll say it obviously in translation. He said as follows: I have to inform the Knesset that a short time ago one of the great Nazi war criminals, Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible together with the Nazi leaders for what they called the final solution, which is the annihilation of 6 million European Jews, was discovered by the Israeli security services. Adolf Eichmann is already under arrest in Israel and will be placed on trial shortly under the terms of the law for the trial of Nazis and their collaborators. It was perhaps the greatest bombshell ever dropped in any discussion in the Knesset. There was this initial silence followed by shock, followed by people trying to understand how could this happen, and what happened in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, was then mirrored when the news brought the story out within Israel and echoed 1,000-fold around the world. Now, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, which followed this, changed Israel's situation internationally. It changed the standing of the Jewish state within the world of the Jewish people. It made enormous changes within Israeli society in terms of the Jewish identity being added to, and in many cases transcending what had been the beginnings of an Israeli identity. And I'm not going to speak about any of those things, despite their importance. I'm going to focus on the trial itself, and in particular the impact that the trial had on how Holocaust survivors were viewed in Israel, but to a certain extent around the world as well. And to do that, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to begin by speaking about how Holocaust survivors were perceived within the state of Israel before the trial. Then I'm going to talk about three figures, the chief prosecutor and two of the witnesses, whose words during the trial had an outsized effect, and who collectively and together with the other witnesses who gave testament as to what had happened in Europe, managed to change the minds of literally millions of people. And third, I'm going to try to step back at the end and talk about what was this transformation that happened in the way Israelis perceived Holocaust survivors. And time and voice permitting at the end of that, and in particular time, be happy to take questions or comments or thoughts. So you should develop them as we go. So, how were the survivors seen? And I want to begin with two stories. The first one comes from one of the survivors himself, Mickey Goldman. Mickey Goldman went on to become Mickey Gilad, and he was born in Katowice in Poland in 1925. And his area, like Poland, like so much of Europe, was overrun by the Nazis. And not surprisingly, he ended up in a ghetto. And when you ended up in a ghetto, you could very easily come out on the wrong side of an SS Nazi officer. And in this particular case, he was whipped not once, not twice, not 25 times, not 50 times, but 80 times. And according to medical experts, a teenager, especially one undernourished in ghetto conditions, won't live past 50 lashes. But there was something in him that wouldn't allow him to die. And so after 80 lashes, the SS man said, "Get up and run away." And he got up, and he ran away. And as it's described by the people who are familiar with the story, the SS man gave him his life back as a gift. He was so in awe or stunned by this will to live. So he wasn't done yet at that point, because he ended up going to Auschwitz. And afterwards he ended up in a forced death march. And after being liberated by Soviet troops, he wanted to fight against the Nazis himself. So he joined the Soviet army, fought against Germany, fought against the Nazis, was injured, recovered, made his way to a DP camp, a displaced person camp, and got on a boat. Not so surprisingly, given the story, the boat was called Hatikva, the Hope, destined for Israel, May of 1947. But the boat was intercepted by the British, who ruled Palestine, and for reasons we won't get into, did not want to allow Jews in any real number to come into the country. And so this man who had survived the fires of hell and beyond didn't get to come to Israel. He was interned in Cyprus for 1.5 years. And only after Israel existed was he, for several months, was he allowed to come into the country, freed by the British. And after all that, in Israel, he suffered what he called the 81st blow. Makah 81. The 81st blow was when he would tell people his story. They wouldn't believe him. They'd either say or they'd think, if all those things happened to you, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be alive. You wouldn't have made it to where you've made it. There must be something that you're hiding, something you're making up, something just isn't kosher in this story. He wasn't the only person to suffer that 81st blow. There are different ways of counting who qualified as a Holocaust survivor, but a fair estimate is to say that Israel had 500,000 Holocaust survivors. Most of the survivors preferred to come to Israel over their other choices, and they encountered a reaction, especially from the Sabras. Sabra is it's a cactus, it's a local thing, but it's a native-born, homegrown Israeli. And as seen by the Sabras, there was a problem with the Holocaust survivors. Really, there were three different problems. Number one, there was this sense that although they had not been killed, they were part of a group of people, Jews in Europe, who had gone like sheep to the slaughter. And so there was this sense, if we, the tough Israelis, we, the people whose army in 1948 managed to defeat 5 invading Arab armies, if we had been there, this story would have had a radically different ending. We wouldn't have done what they did. So there was this sense of contempt. Second, there was this idea, how exactly did you survive? Most people were killed. In order to survive, you must have made some pretty significant moral compromises. You must have been, you were a capo, or you stole from other Jews the last rations they had, or you found some way to prefer your life, your blood, as being preferable, as being redder than others. So they were looked upon both as people who could have gone like sheep to the slaughter, as people who had done something immoral, or as people whose story just couldn't add up, because nobody could have gone through what they went through and lived to tell the tale. And the ultimate of this, as I think people are familiar with, is that Holocaust survivors were called sabon. It's based on the story, apparently, according to people who have researched it, not correct. But the story was that the Nazis would boil the fat of the Jews whom they murdered and make soap. And so when you saw somebody with a number on his arm, and you were a mischievous, nasty, young Israeli, you'd scream at him, sabon, and run away, soap. What did it mean? It meant you were this close to being reduced to soap. And if it were up to you and people like you, that's what would have happened. But you had some luck, or other people were heroic and saved you. Somehow you didn't end up that way. But in my eyes, that's what you could have been, and that's what you are. And so I always wondered, could kids, we all know kids are cruel, or can be cruel, and we all know that in extreme circumstances, after horrific events, people can say inappropriate things. But is this story actually true? So a few years ago, I was telling a friend of mine, I won't share his name at the moment, but suffice it to say that he is one of Israel's top academics in his field, a well-known, very thoughtful public intellectual. And I told him I was doing some research on the Eichmann Trial, and he said, I'll tell you something. Do you ever hear those stories about the kids screaming out soap? I was one of those kids. I was a teenager growing up here in the 1950s, and I am ashamed now to say that those stories are real, and I was part of it. So I said I would share 2 stories. One is from the point of view of Mickey Goldman and the 500,000 Mickey Goldmans for whom the way Israelis treated them, at least many Israelis in certain circumstances, felt like the 81st blow. And it's very real. We actually know Israelis who were part of this. I need to be clear. This was not the dominant view, and there was a great deal that was done for Holocaust survivors. And overall, it's a story that should fill us with pride. But the experience of the Holocaust survivors was, you really shouldn't talk about it. It happened to you, it's a terrible thing, we're glad that you've come here, we're happy to provide housing, we hope you rebuild your lives, but you should probably keep it to yourselves. So that was the attitude pre-trial. I want to talk about what happened in the Eichmann Trial that changed this, and I'm going to do it again through a limited number of stories. I'm going to talk about three people. The first one is the prosecutor, who played the lead role in the prosecution in the case, Gideon Hausner. And then I'm going to talk about two of the witnesses. But the story begins with Hausner, who's a somewhat unlikely hero. He was born in 1915 in Lemberg in Galicia, which at the time was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but later on came to be part of Poland. And he moved with his family to Israel when he was 12 in 1927, went on to study law. Like most people his age, he fought in the War of Independence. He was a military prosecutor, and then in the 1950s he did what many, many fine people do, including my father of blessed memory. He became a corporate lawyer. Perfectly reasonable. 1950s, opened up his own firm. And on the side, he was also involved in politics. Because, he's a lawyer, he's Jewish, it's Israel, And he ended up running for Knesset in one of the many, many parties that existed back then, just as there are many, many parties that exist today. And he was in the number 8 slot in a party that only got 6 seats. So now what does he do? Well, he's a pretty good lawyer. And the position of Attorney General came up. And through a combination of factors, he was appointed as Attorney General. And shortly afterwards, this smart, seasoned corporate lawyer has handed to him the single biggest case in Israel's history, the Eichmann Trial. And he has to decide what to do with it. And of course, everybody's telling him, look, you're a great guy, you're wonderful, but you're not a criminal lawyer. You haven't been a prosecutor. This case is going to be on the international scene for literally months. Step aside. And so, he didn't. He decided this was his debt, and he was going to pay it himself. It was his debt to the Holocaust survivors, his debt to the people from Poland who hadn't left when his family left, and he was going to take it on. And so he spent many, many weeks with survivors. And the story goes, he wasn't sure that he could really handle this case because he didn't really know what it was like to have been there. Right? For an Israeli, there was Europe during the Holocaust, and here was Israel. And he wasn't sure, did he know enough about being there? And at the end of one of these through-the-night conversations with two of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they said to him, you know what? You speak as if you were there. You speak like one of us. And then he knew he could do the case. So we have to develop a strategy. And the strategy that had been developed previously, right, we're all familiar with the Nuremberg trials after World War II of the Nazi war criminals, and all the smart people understand if you want to convict Nazis, let the Nazis do the work for you. Right? They were punctilious about documentation, and so they incriminated themselves. And although the Gestapo was able to destroy most of their documents, apparently literally in crematoria and through burning and such, most of the German documents, or at least many of the German documents, remained. So the theory was, don't bring witnesses. People are going to challenge their view, and how do you remember that? And you were half starved, and you can't really know what this person looks like, and you're so bitter, understandably, about what happened that you're willing to say anything, and on and on. So you didn't bring witnesses. And Hausner was told that not only as a historical precedent, but also the police, they knew a thing or two about how to conduct investigations, said, trust us. You'll find all the documentation that you need. Don't bring witnesses. And he said, I'm going to bring witnesses. And they said, don't bring a lot of witnesses. And in the end, he brought 111 witnesses and structured the entire case around them. He put them front and center. Right? Again, going against what everybody told him because he felt like this was their story. And even though he had a certain understanding of their perspective, he couldn't tell it as if he had been there because he hadn't been there. So it's the night before the opening of the trial. It took from Ben-Gurion's announcement in May of 1960, it took until April of 1961, nearly a full year, in order to prepare all of the documents, because documents were still going to be part of the trial, and to find the witnesses and to make sure you've got the right ones and their stories are credible and they'll tell them in a way that's clear. And he and his amazing team of deputies and assistants in the prosecutor's office and the police and so on had prepared an 8-hour speech that he was going to be giving over the course of 2 days. It's literally a book. I know that because I own the book. He spoke an entire book. And it's the night before, and he decides, you know what? Okay, it's been translated to 4 languages. We have a final version. Everybody's set for it. It doesn't put this trial within the proper context. Right? This trial is an incredible thing. The Jewish people who 16 years ago were powerless and were at the mercy of people like Adolf Eichmann have reversed it so that today we can actually place them at the bar of justice. And I have to find a way to say that on behalf of the survivors. So he sat down late at night and scrawled something out on a piece of paper. And he did what any reasonable person would do at that point, unsure if your statement is going to be the right one or if it's going to blow these months of careful preparation. He woke up his wife. A good move. Now, the story as he tells it is, he woke up his wife middle of the night, and she said, after hearing him give this opening, yes, this is right. Now, we only have his version. She might have said a few things before that, what she thought about the hour and so on, but for the version that my wife Jocelyn, who's here today, should hear, what you say when your husband wakes you in the middle of the night because he wants to read something from a speech is you say, I'm happy, dear, to listen, and then you say, yes, this is right. Or at least that's what she did. So, he gets up the next day and pulls out, in addition to the whole printed speech, he's got these handwritten notes. The translators are scrambling around because they know they don't have this version. And he opens with what are the most famous lines in any speech ever given in Israel. במקום זה בו אני עומד לפניכם שופטי ישראל ללמד קטגוריה על אדולף אייכמן. אין אני עומד יחידי. עמדי ניצבים כאן בשעה זו 6 מיליון קטגורים. In the place where I am standing before you today, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I do not stand alone. With me are 6 million prosecutors, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger at he who sits in the glass-encased witness dock. This is a reference to Eichmann. He was behind bulletproof glass because there was a concern, quite reasonably, that somebody might want to kill him for what he had done. Right? But they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger towards him who sits in the glass-encased witness dock and cry out, J'accuse, I accuse, ani ma'ashim. For their ashes are piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and in the fields of Treblinka, and they have been washed away by the rivers of Poland. Their graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voice is not heard. Therefore, I will be their mouthpiece, and in their name I will unfold this terrible indictment. And the court was riveted. And Israeli society was riveted. Right? We know from the Central Bureau of Statistics that 60% of all Israelis ages 14 and above listened to part or all of the first day of the trial, or the first day of the prosecution. There had been some preliminary motions, but the first day of the trial, and had heard these words. And they were so riveted by this and by what followed that literally for the entire 4 months of the trial, the main thing on the radio, and there were people who would listen to it day in and day out, was this trial. Right? There were 750 seats. And teenagers, maybe the same ones who had been saying sabon when they saw someone with a number on his arm, tattooed, were playing hooky, getting out of school in order to get one of those seats. And if you wanted to go out on a date and you really wanted to impress the young woman, you would get 2 tickets. And you would go to the Eichmann Trial to hear what had actually happened. But most people weren't in that group of 750 each day. There are also dignitaries and journalists and so on. And so what they had to do was they listened to the radio. And they listened not just to Hausner, but he paved the way for the only people in the world who could stand in for his 6 million co-prosecutors. And those were the witnesses. And the strategy was to go country by country, episode by episode, and to trace what had happened. And then to trace what had happened on death marches and what had happened in the work camps, in the concentration camps, what had happened in the death camps. And they did it witness by witness. And the stories are absolutely incredible. This is, they came out in book form. This is half of the witnesses, and it's very fine print. Right? They said a lot, and they said very powerful things. I'll give you one brief story of a witness that I'm not going to talk about. Dr. Joseph Buzminski. He spoke about the atrocities that he had seen. And among other things, he described having seen a teenager who was whipped 80 times and got up and ran away. And Hausner asked him, "Do you see that teenager in this room?" And he points and says, "He's the gentleman right over there." And Hausner says, "Yes, that's right. That's Mickey Goldman. He's one of the inspectors for the police. He played one of the most critical roles in the trial. And what had happened is this witness came in, as all of them did in advance, to tell his story. And he sees this guy, and they quickly understood that this was the boy who had been whipped to death, except that he refused to die." That's the kind of story that these witnesses brought. But I'm going to talk about witness Moshe Beisky.
Dan, could we trouble you to talk a little bit louder? There's some awful lot of noise coming from this direction.
Okay, that's one possible response to a man who's like gasping with water to maintain his voice. Sure, I would love to speak more loudly. It's fine. It's fine. Bezrat Hashem, my voice will hold out. So, Dr. Moshe Beisky, at the time he testified in May of 1961, was a judge in the magistrate court of Tel Aviv. And he hadn't always been a judge. He was born in 1921 in Krakow, and he was interned in the Plaszow camp just outside of Krakow. Famous camp there was built literally on top of the old Jewish cemetery, and the gravestones were used to kind of pave the way. And he described life in the camp, and he spoke about many things that are hard for anybody to believe. And he spoke about the public hangings that the Nazis would sometimes hold in order to bring about an even higher level of terror, where they would come, the SS men would point their machine guns at people and say, "Not only do you have to be here, you have to look at this hanging." And I'm now going to try to do what Gideon Hausner did, which is to let the survivors speak. So rather than trying to tell the story, I'm going to let him tell the story with a little bit of help from Hausner and occasionally the presiding judge, who interjected with questions. So the judge says, "I would ask you please to be seated." Because he sees this is pretty emotional, hard to talk when you're standing up. It's an event that is bringing you back to a period of weakness and powerlessness and terror. But Beisky's a man of the court. He's a judge. You stand out of respect when you're in a court. And so here's what happens. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I shall continue standing." All those people, referring to the 15 to 20,000 inhabitants of the camp, stood on the ground, and the 2 persons were brought to the gallows. A lad of 15, Haubenstock, and the engineer Krautwirth, and an order was given to hang them. Attorney Hausner asked, "For what? For what offense?" Beisky says, it was said in camp that the young Haubenstock had sung a Russian tune. He sung a Russian tune, and that was a capital offense to the Nazis, because the Russians are on the other side. The offense of the engineer Krautwert, I don't know. The boy was hanged and something happened which occurs once in many thousands of cases. The rope broke. The boy stood there. He was again lifted onto a high chair which was placed under the rope, and he began to beg for mercy. An order was given to hang him a second time, and then he was raised a second time to the gallows and hanged. Beisky goes on to describe how the camp commandant, the head person there, pulled out a gun and shot the boy once more, just to be sure, and then he describes the hanging of the engineer. And then Hausner catches him by surprise. Right? Usually the attorney and the witnesses have agreed on things in advance, but Hausner, as a strategy, decided he would ask him a question that they hadn't prepared so he would get the most honest answer. He bursts out and says, 15,000 people stood there, and opposite them only hundreds of guards. Why didn't you attack then? Why didn't you revolt? But he was asking the question that was on the minds of all these Israelis. Why did you go like sheep to the slaughter? We would have done differently. And Beisky says as follows. I believe that this thing cannot be explained. It cannot be answered. To this there is no single reply. What I can talk of is the general situation. And perhaps from this it can be deduced. It will certainly be difficult for anyone who was not there to understand. But after all, this happened in the middle of 1943. This was already in the third year of the war. And it didn't begin with this. It began with something else. The people were already, the whole of Jewry was already in a state of depression owing to what they had endured during these 3 years. This is one thing. Right? So he's saying, we were terrorized in a way that nobody in this court or listening in the world could understand. And he goes on. And the second, nevertheless, there was still hope. Here were people working on forced labor. They apparently, the Germans, needed this work. Possibly, maybe. It was plain at the time that if anyone did the pettiest thing, for it was not difficult when many forces were standing there, may now be permitted to sit. Right? That last paragraph, I didn't make it incoherent. It was incoherent because a man who had been speaking in full paragraphs was suddenly reduced by the force of this question and what it reminded him of to say a number of different things. But what he's saying is, we thought that if they were forcing us to work, they needed the work, and so they wouldn't kill us. And we also knew that if we did anything the slightest bit wrong, we'd be killed. And he goes, presiding jury. So he says, may I now be permitted to sit? The man who, out of respect for the court, didn't want to sit, at this point had to. And he says, first of all, I can no longer, and I acknowledge this, after 18 years, I cannot describe the sensation of fear. This feeling of fear, today when I stand before your honors, does not exist any longer. And I do not suppose that it is possible to define it for anyone. After all, this thing is ultimately a terror-inspiring fear. People stand facing machine guns. Right? He's not talking about people, he's talking about himself. Right? People stand facing machine guns, and the mere fact of gazing upon the hanging of a boy and his cries, and then in fact, no ability remains to react. And he goes on. I won't share the entire thing, but the entire thing is worth hearing. It's worth reading. You can actually see much of the testimony. It's available in the archives. It's available on YouTube. It's available at Yad Vashem, which does Avodat Kodesh, holy work. And he describes how if you left, if you escaped, you'd endanger the lives of all 15,000 people, because the Nazis believed in collective punishment. And these words were particularly powerful coming from him because he had worked outside the camp, and it was well known that he was one of the people who could have escaped. But he didn't do it because he didn't want to endanger the other 15,000. And he went on to explain that there was a Polish camp right next to ours. They could have gone 100 meters, and they would have been in homes where somebody would have taken care of them. And we couldn't. But none of them escaped. And if we escaped, if we fled, where would we go? They had uniforms that were basically concentration camp uniforms. They had a 4 centimeter, say 1.5 inch strip shaved out of their hair so that they would be more easily identifiable. And he gives this answer, and he ends These are, moreover, not the only reasons, Your Honors. Anyone today trying to find the causes, I do not know whether he could find them for one simple reason. It is not physically possible to present the conditions of those days in the courtroom. And I do not believe, heaven forbid, that people will not understand this. But I myself cannot explain it, and I experienced this on my own person. And he's not only saying, you can't understand because you weren't there, but he's even saying, 18 years later, I can't understand because it's so far removed from any genuinely human experience. Not only was this an earthquake in how the people in the courtroom saw Holocaust survivors, but throughout the state of Israel there was this sense, so all along we thought it would have been different if we were there, but when you're hearing basically describe step by step what happened and what they thought and what were the options, you're suddenly putting yourself in his place and you're thinking, my God, he's right. If I had been there, I would have been terrorized like the rest, and maybe I would have been more of a coward and I would have fled and endangered the lives of all the others. Moshe Tavor, writing in the Devar newspaper, which was the newspaper really of the Labor Party, but of the Histadrut, the Workers' Party, the Workers' Union, wrote, "Let us hang our heads in humility at this answer." Meaning, we have been humbled by what he said. Chaim Gori was covering the trial for Le Merchav. Gori was another Sabra. He'd been in the Palmach, he'd been fairly high-ranking during the War of Independence. He'd actually gone to Europe the year after, so he's a little more sensitized than most to the condition of Holocaust survivors and to their sensitivities. And he wrote about the trial, his impressions, which he filed almost daily, can be found in this book. You can buy a copy, but yours won't come with the green tape flags. You have to put them in yourselves. And he wrote as follows about the day in which Beisky testified. Suddenly I realized that today I had not looked into the glass booth at Eichmann. The events being described were larger than he was. Chaim Gori, who I had the privilege of meeting a couple of times late in his life, passed away a few years ago, so I can't now ask him the question I would love to ask him, which is, what exactly did you mean when you said the events were larger than Eichmann? So I have to give my best guess. I think he heard a man with the godless, with the greatness of Beisky. And he understood that in the world of evil, Eichmann's about as towering and monstrous a figure as you can find or even imagine. But in the real world, when you're measuring greatness, it's not in the Eichmanns, it's in the Beiskys. And the real greatness was outside, so he didn't even look through the glass case because he knew the real story was in the witness stand. The real story was the people who had survived. So I've spoken about the prosecutor, I've spoken about one witness. I'll speak about a second witness, and they'll have to stand in for all 111 of them. Her name is Rivka Yoselevska. She was born in a town near Pinsk. In 1934, she was married. She had a daughter. She's one of the cases very much not a public figure. Basically, he was a judge. He was on his way up. He was fairly well known. I think roughly nobody had heard of Rivka Yoselevska. She heard about the trial. She heard they were looking for witnesses. She had seen something pretty horrific. And she came in and told her story. Hausner reports in his memoir of the trial, the same one in which he wrote about writing the opening to his speech the night before, and he wrote that only twice during the entire Eichmann episode did he cry. Once was when they got word that Eichmann had been executed and his ashes scattered outside of Israel's territorial waters so that there would be no trace of him to pollute our country. That was the one time he cried. But the first time he cried was when he heard her story. She was rather agitated in the days before she was going to give her testimony. And a few days before she was due to testify, she had a heart attack. And at the appointed hour, she stood up to give her testimony. In Yiddish, because that was her native language, and she wanted to make sure that she said it the way that she meant. And I'll just say, I'm going to be quoting from what she said. It's pretty rough stuff, but no rougher than what the teenagers who played hooky to go to the trial heard, because she described what actually happened. So if you are very squeamish about these kinds of descriptions, you're free to cover your ears or to step out. It's rough stuff, but that's the world that David and Fela, of blessed memory, survived and emerged and came out strong from, and it's the world that we have to understand if we truly believe in the phrase "never again." So she describes what happened once the Nazis invaded her town. They, of course, set up a ghetto. Sometimes it was possible to work outside of the ghetto. She describes an experience where she, coming back from work, did what normal parents did, which is you try to find a way to smuggle food in for your kid. So she hid some sugar in her hair, but unfortunately one of the guards, I think from Belarus, Russia, saw her, and there was an SS German next to the guard, so the guard couldn't even cheat or take a bribe or something. The sugar was found, started beating her. Rivka's mother, who was waiting for her daughter to come back, waiting with children, probably including Rivka's own daughter, screamed out, "Beat me instead of her." And the Nazi, of course, said, "We'll do both," and brought her out and beat both of them in front of the children. But the children knew that they couldn't cry, because if you cried, the Nazis would use that as a reason to beat your mother or grandmother or neighbor even further. So that's the reality that she's describing. And then she talks about what happened on Rosh Chodesh Elul 1942. Now, I'm standing in a yeshiva, and there's no day happier than Rosh Chodesh Elul, because that's the day not only that Jews can begin the repentance process with renewed vigor in advance of the Yamim Noraim, but it's the day when yeshiva study starts up again. And the Nazis knew a thing or two. And they took every Chag, even the ones that not every Jew knows about, and they turned it into a horror show. And so they did a roundup, and they took the town's residents. There were, among other people, there were 4 Germans, whom Yoselevska refers to as the Malachei HaMavet, the angels of death. And they're forcing everybody onto trucks, but not everybody could fit on the trucks, and there wasn't room for her. So we now go directly to the testimony. Hausner says, "And you were running with your little girl." She answers, "I was holding my little girl and running after the truck too. Many mothers had 2 or 3 children. All the way we had to run. When somebody fell down, they wouldn't let him get up. They shot him on the spot. All my family was there. We arrived at the place. Those who had been on the truck had already gotten down, undressed, and stood in a row." Where was it? It was about 3 kilometers, 2 miles away from our town. There was a hill, and a little below it they had dug something like a ditch. They made us walk up to the hill in rows of 4. And the 4 whom we likened to angels of death shot each one of us separately. What did you see when you came there? When we arrived at this place, we saw naked people standing there already, so we thought maybe they are being tortured. Perhaps there was still hope we would remain alive after this. To get away was impossible. I wish to add that when they lined us up in the ghetto, my little daughter asked, "Mommy, why are you wearing your Sabbath dress? They are going to kill us." Girl's 6 or 7 years old. Even when we stood near the ditch, my daughter said, "What are we waiting for? Come, let's escape." Some of the younger ones tried to run away. They hardly managed a few steps. They were caught and shot. Then came our turn. It was difficult to hold the children. They were shaking. We took turns. Parents took the children, took other people's children. This was to help us get through it all, to get it over with and not see the children suffer. Mothers took leave of their children, the mothers, the parents. You can just imagine the scene, or if it's too painful, try not to imagine the scene. And she describes it. Here I'll paraphrase a little bit just to tone down the power slightly. She describes each of her family members. Her father refused to get undressed. It was a matter of dignity. They tortured him. His family begged him, "Please stop the suffering." He refused. Dignity is dignity. They shot him and they stripped him to remove his dignity after they removed his life. She describes how her mother was killed. She describes her sisters being killed. Then the angel of death comes to her, and she's holding her daughter. And he says, whom do I shoot first? I didn't answer. He tore the child away from me. I heard her last cry, and he shot her. Then he got ready to kill me, grabbed my hair, and turned my head about. I remained standing and heard a shot, but I didn't move. Apparently the shot misfired something. So he turned me around, loaded his pistol, right? He wanted her to see that he was preparing to kill her, so that I could see what he was doing. Then he again turned me around and shot me. This time it grazed her head. I fell down. Then you fell into the pit. And she describes the feeling that she was dead, but somehow she still heard things and somehow still felt things. And then she describes in graphic terms climbing up through this stack of bodies, because after she was shot and presumably, but not actually killed, others were killed and fell on top of her. She describes what it was like to get out. The children who hadn't been fully murdered, and she goes to them. She helps at least one other woman get out, and then even the prosecutor says, "Please let us be brief, Mrs. Yoshalevska. It is difficult to recount and difficult to listen to." And she describes the Germans coming back, and then after the Germans had finally left and she had managed to escape it, she says, "When I saw they were gone, I dragged myself over to the grave and wanted to jump in. I thought the grave would open up and let me fall inside alive. I envied everyone for whom it was already over while I was still alive. Where should I go? What should I do? I sat there on the grave and tried to dig my way in with my hands. I continued digging as hard as I could. The earth didn't open up. I shouted to mother and father. Why was I left alive? What did I do to deserve this? Where shall I go? To whom can I turn? I have nobody. I saw everything. I saw everybody killed. No one answered. I remained sprawled on the grave 3 days and 3 nights. Then he asks, and then a peasant passed by and took pity on you. Yes, I remained not far from the grave. A peasant saw me. I'd been wandering around there for several weeks. He saw me. He took pity on you and gave you food, and then you joined a group of Jews in the forest and stayed with them till the Soviets came. Yes, till the end I stayed with them, with the partisans. And then abruptly Hausner says, and now you are married with 2 children. And she says, yes. And the defense attorney is asked, do you have any further questions? Do you have any questions for the witness? And he knows there's nothing he can ask that will possibly make this witness look bad or his client look like anything less than a horrific monster. So he has no questions for the witness. And then the prosecutor and the judge make it clear her testimony is over. Rivka Yoselevska became the symbol for the Jewish people, or if you prefer, for the state of Israel. A woman who was literally murdered, except she refused to die, was in the death pits, lost everything, lost her daughter, lost her husband, he'd been killed previously, lost her parents, her siblings, came out with nothing, survived the war, came to Israel, married 2 children. Continuity. The next generation. We won't give the Nazis the final victory. Take the 2 examples of witnesses that I gave you. Hausner as the architect and the person who paved the way through his words and his decisions. And you're ready for the third and final part of what I said I wanted to speak about, which is going to be brief. What was the impact on Israeli society? So I'll start with my friend, the one who had called survivors sabon, soap. He told me he didn't really go to school much when he was a teenager. He didn't find it interesting, didn't listen to his parents, didn't find them worth listening to, did whatever he wanted to. And during the trial, what he wanted to do was listen to the trial day in and day out. He was shocked at what he heard and captivated. And he was one of those people, I think, about whom it could be said that he needed to hang his head in humility after hearing Beisky and again after hearing Yoselevska. And he told me he was ashamed of what he had done. It was the trial that turned him around. Although he's quite secular in many respects, he always says, I'm a Jew first, and I'm an Israeli, and a proud Israeli and a Zionist, because I'm a Jew, and I connect to the Jewish people. And it was the trial that did that for him. Now multiply that times 1.5 million people who comprise that element of Israeli society which was not survivors. It was Chaim Gori who I think summed it up most beautifully. And I'll read a few paragraphs in the really superbly done translation. It's now September of 1961. The trial itself had ended in August. The court's deliberating. There's all kinds of behind-the-scenes motions and pressure, but from his point of view, he's had a month to think about the trial. If a new leaf has been turned over, it is inside us. And he's not us as we Israelis, we Sabras. We now see things differently. Thanks. We have set aside a memorial day for the Holocaust and heroism, and in doing so have drawn a subtle distinction between the two, as if we had juxtaposed them as complementary but different. A very important reference, Yom HaShoah V'Gvura. Right? The idea is that there is a memorial day for the Holocaust, which is the terrible things done for us, and the heroism, which is mostly about the revolts in the rebellions in the ghettos and some of the death camps. And he says, we thought that there was this difference, and that we were proud of the heroes, but not so proud of the other Jews. The Holocaust was a source of shame to us, like some awful blemish visible to all. And then he goes on, but we must ask the forgiveness of the multitudes whom we have judged in our hearts, we who were outside that circle. And we often judge them without asking ourselves what right we had to do so. A survey conducted by Yahrtzeit among Israeli teenagers who had never seen a whip with a swastika emblazoned on it, meaning they had never been to anything like or had any exposure to anything like the Holocaust, showed that right up to the beginning of this trial there were those who said, had we been there, we would not have gone to our deaths the way they did, or we would have acted differently. And some of those interviewed said it all too readily in their charming, native-born Israeli way, with no pause between question and answer for silence or apology. Until the witnesses came and explained to us once again how hard it was for someone who, quote, wasn't there to understand what it was like. And we began to understand not from the abstraction that it, quote, was hard to resist, but from the detailed stories that at the end of the day left us too close to the state of utter paralysis in which the victims had found themselves the whole time. I mean, just listening to this, we were paralyzed. Finally, we could understand who they were and what they went through. And then he talks about heroism. The heroism not just of those who revolted, but of everybody who came through the Holocaust and had managed to maintain some element of the tselem enosh, of our human figure, of who HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us to be as human beings. And he writes, we now know more than ever, and it is the most important thing that we did not know about. The pity and the succor, meaning the way that people helped each other out. The Hebrew and arithmetic exercise books at the brink of the grave. They were teaching their kids to the last moment. The light of prayer. Right? He's not a religious person, but he writes movingly throughout the book about Jews who had prayed when it was dangerous. The hand on the shoulder of support. The lips on the forehead, the kiss of affection. The loving farewells, the words spoken when all hope was lost and no one else was left. The assurance that the shame is not yours but your persecutors, which is what people told one another in those last moments. through these stories, through the reactions, I think we can see the transformation of the survivors in Israel and also around the world from the marginalized, from the people we're embarrassed about, or at least we don't want to hear from them, to the people before whom the rest of us have to hang our heads in humility and perhaps in shame for not having understood them. And Israelis and others around the world came to see the heroism not only of what you did during the time when you survived against all odds, but what you did after to climb out of that metaphorical, or in some cases literal, pit of death and to rebuild a life. We are all here, both those of us in the room and those joining us via Zoom, to commemorate two such heroes. Two people who climbed out of their pits, and the story of David and Fela of blessed memory is an incredible, incredible story. How they survived it and how they went on to rebuild Jewish life. And it's that heroism of the survivors that is such an inspiration. It's an inspiration to all Jews. It certainly is an inspiration to every one of us. We should be touched by what the Shapells did to build their family, to build their community, to build Holocaust remembrance around the world, and of course to build the place in which we are sitting now and to which so many of us owe such an enormous debt of gratitude. But that debt of gratitude is owed especially to these survivors who have built incredible things, of which perhaps the most significant is the role model of their lives and the way they live their lives. And it's an honor for all of us to be able to commemorate it. And again, I want to give thanks for the opportunity to speak here. We have a little bit of time left, and I would be happy to take questions. And I have enough water as my ammunition so I can answer whatever questions time permits. Yes, Doug.
Thank you. To what extent, I feel, when I grew up a long time ago, I felt more connected to the stories of the Holocaust, and I'm concerned that both in America and perhaps Europe and even in Israel, that these stories and what you've described are becoming part and parcel of a huge curriculum, and the kids get just a very little bit. And this the impression that we're leaving from, that you've given to us, that we're leaving with today, is not something that the next generation is really getting other than an academic exercise. I know you have a little experience in the education world. Could you comment if this is correct?
So what you have described is the great danger. The danger of forgetting. And that danger is real for anything that happens, tragic or heroic. And yet at the same time, there have been some extraordinary efforts, and the Shapells have been at the center of many of them. That cough was just to prove that I wasn't kidding. Those efforts have managed to bring people, even those who don't know anyone who was alive at the time of the Holocaust, or at least nobody who was in Europe at that time, it's enabled them to at least appreciate part of that experience. Yad Vashem, as it was refurbished, rebuilt a number of years ago, is, simply put, the single most powerful, spectacular, memorable, educational museum that I've ever been to anywhere in the world. You come through there and you're in shock, and you're in tears, and you're in awe, but something has happened. The March of the Living is in which, and this is not something that was being done in the 50s or 60s, it's a much more recent phenomenon, bringing young people, right? Most at least in our circles, in non-corona years, all the high schoolers, just about all the high schoolers go through it. Our five oldest all went on a March of the Living. Our sixth was coroned out of it. He'll find his opportunity. But people come back from those experiences changed. There are efforts to create videos that give you the survivor testimony. There are a range of things, and they're the best we have as the last of the survivors are passing away. And we'll have to do the very best we can with what we have, because the message that comes from the Holocaust is a message that doesn't come from anything else. I think that's why David and Fela, blessed memory, were so focused on this. That's why their family is focused on it. And that's why educators, whether or not they think it's the right thing to do to use the Holocaust, understand that if you don't harness its incredible power, a message that's of importance on a personal level and a national level is going to be lost. So I think if we, not only the people in this room and the virtual room, but we, the people who see ourselves as responsible for the education of the next generation and the generation after that, will do the right things, following the footsteps of the Shapells, then I think we can avoid the very serious danger you spoke about. Yes?
As a follow-up to the question, so like you said, the remaining alive survivors of the Holocaust who are living out their lives hopefully as full as they can in the time that they have, the numbers are going down, and I'm 20, and I've met maybe 2 or 3 survivors, and that was when I was like in elementary school. You know, when like they came in to talk, or like a family member of a friend or a great grandmother or something. You know. So my question is, I feel it's less of a question, more like asking for confirmation on a statement. Looking at the Jewish perspective of even stuff that happened so long ago, like Hanukkah and Pesach, like we're still remembering these things to this day. We're doing it as a lesson in how we live our lives. So I feel like the fear that the world might forget the horrors of the Holocaust, I feel somewhat confident that the Jewish people probably won't.
That was incredibly beautiful. Thank you. I just want to amplify that. What you've just said is that forgetting is a challenge for any people. But we are the people who still recount, who still celebrate, or who still mourn events that happened thousands of years ago. And when we pray, we're still talking about Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and we speak about Moshe Rabbeinu, and we speak about the Arba Imahot, our 4 mothers, and we speak about the Exodus from Egypt as if each one of us had been a part of it. And your answer to Doug's question, I think, frames this. The challenge is extraordinarily difficult, right? We've succeeded in remembering these things because our rabbis, Chazal, brilliantly transformed Judaism so that the national sentiment could be kept outside of the land through our holidays and our commemorations. We are not the rabbis of the Talmud, but b'makom she'ein anashim yishtadel liot ish, as Pirkei Avot teaches us, in a place where there is no great man, seek, or where there are no great people, seek to be a great person. And every one of us needs to try to take it upon ourselves to find a way so that this memory is preserved and passed down for the generation which will not know of any of the Holocaust survivors directly. And whether it's through the things we say, or it's through videos, or the lessons we impart in our homes, or as educators, or in the public square, we have to emulate the people who never forgot what was important, and therefore always remembered the most significant things, and were able to rise up time after time. Yes?
To go off what both of them were saying, there was a recent Pew study that was done that was showing that there are significant increases and stats of Americans overall that are basically not believing in the Holocaust anymore, to a point where school systems are now implementing the Holocaust into the academic curriculum. But as someone who grew up Reform, as a Baal Teshuva in my time in Hebrew school, I've also sort of never really had a personal experience so much with the Holocaust. Then it was mostly just academic based, reading texts like Anne Frank and things like that. So I asked the question for Israel, because even in the United States, we have lots of Holocaust memorial museums, and even in Israel we have Yad Vashem. Is there a growing statistic in Israelis that there's like a desensitization of the Holocaust here over time? Because I saw it in the recent news that Yad Vashem is kind of like getting less funding and less people are going. So I'm just curious what Israel is doing in this regard.
So the short and honest answer is I don't know. But that makes for a lousy answer. And we don't want to end this on the answer that I don't know. And I think by my watch at least we're just about out of time. So I have a sense of it, and my sense is that Israel is a very different place in this respect from the rest of the world in general and the United States in particular. And it's a different place because Israelis, unfortunately, are reminded on a regular basis that there are people who hate us and would like to destroy us. Not just as individuals, but as a collective. So when you read about people who are actively calling for the destruction of your state, and you then hear about the Holocaust in which the Nazis actively sought to murder every Jew in Europe and probably beyond if only they could have, you don't think, well, that could never have happened. You think, yes, that is how the world sometimes works. And so Israelis, quite apart from the success of our vaccination program against COVID, have a certain vaccination against Holocaust denial and Holocaust forgetting, because it fits with our experience. And there's something else. Part of what connects us to the Holocaust is the sense of Jewish peoplehood. The sense that the Jew who was murdered in Pinsk or in Warsaw or from Salonika or Budapest is part of my family. And Israelis, for whatever criticism it's fashionable to make, we don't have the same spirit we used to have and this and that, there is still a sense that achim anachnu, that we're brethren, that the people in Israel, the people who live in this country and the Jews around the world, they're a part of our family. And I think as long as we preserve that sense of Jewish peoplehood, and as long as we remember how it is that a people with this incredible memory has kept that memory, I believe for generation after generation, just as Israelis observe Pesach, which is our national founding, and Tisha B'Av, which is our national destruction, I believe that they will succeed in remembering the Holocaust. And I should add, the Holocaust, although unique, was a part of Jewish history, a part in which in every generation they arise to destroy us. Right? I'm not making that up. It might be familiar from the Haggadah, among other things. And I think Israelis, we live that history. And again, there is no simple answer. If we in this room writ large, don't do the right things for learning and for education and for memory, then yes, it is possible that in America the Holocaust will be forgotten and the Jewish peoplehood will be forgotten. And it's possible these things will be forgotten in Israel. God forbid. Chas v'shalom. And that's why all of us, and especially those who have benefited from the rebirth of the Shapells after the Holocaust and have benefited from all that they have done, it's incumbent upon all of us to do everything we can so that the incredible heroism and the incredible lessons of the Holocaust and the rebirth of Jews around the world is not forgotten, and rather it should serve as a torch for all of us lighting our way. Thank you very much.